KiwiSaver was a great product that had a whole massive set of issues around it. Very low engagement, very low understanding, and the honest truth that high fees, and the honest truth that it was unlikely to deliver what people expected it to deliver. And so we'd kind of compared the KiwiSaver model then to what was happening internationally. And we thought there was quite a big opportunity to use to give people the answers they need to make some smarter decisions, and also give them some choices. Let's be honest, KiwiSaver, it is your money. It is your hard-earned savings. And so what we were all about was going, well, how do we create a few more options? How do we make it a little bit easy? How do we make it more interesting for people so that we can then get them engaged? Because if we don't get people engaged, the truth is they're going to sleepwalk into some pretty shitty retirements. And so the purpose of our business was all about how do we use our products and our tools to help people make better decisions and increase their engagement in KiwiSaver.
Hello, I am Cody Ellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. In this episode, I talk with Rupert Carlyon, founder and managing director of Kōura Wealth KiwiSaver. KiwiSaver is the voluntary retirement savings scheme for New Zealand, and Kōura Wealth offers a carbon-neutral crypto fund KiwiSaver product, which is Bitcoin only. This is a way for everyday Kiwis to get some kind of Bitcoin exposure with government and employer-matched contributions and tax benefits. New Zealand was very late to the game with retirement savings schemes, and the impact of this is beginning to be felt with very low savings generally and old age poverty issues. With all the talk about Bitcoin ETFs globally, it is interesting to explore how traditional finance in New Zealand interfaces with Bitcoin and the regulatory challenges that have had to be overcome to get this product launched. If you have any questions or feedback, please reach out. My emails are always open, hello@thetransformationofvalue.com. Otherwise, on to the show. I haven't missed one so far, but you start chatting and then you're like, oh shit, we're 20 minutes in and I didn't click the button.
Yeah. It's happened to me before a few times, eh?
Yeah. But
how's Tokyo?
It's good, man. I'm actually south of Tokyo. I used to live in the big city for about 5 years, but having come back to New Zealand and spent time in Wellington, I really realized how important the ocean was. So I'm living closer to the ocean now down south in a place called Kamakura. It's the home of Zen Buddhism and beautiful temples and a bit of surfing and that sort of thing. So very different to the concrete of the city.
That's epic, hey? Sorry, very off topic, but I'm fascinated by this because I love Japan. I've only been twice, but I absolutely loved it. How did you end up in Japan?
It was an interesting story. Long story short, I was I was back in Hastings of all places, just sort of out of high school, and I needed to do something with my life. And I was vacuuming office buildings. I've told the story before, but I just was kind of in between things, and something about like the sound of the vacuum cleaners. It was like very zen, like very meditative. And one day I was on Karamu Road in Hastings, and this bolt of inspiration hit me, and it said, Cody, go to Japan. And so I got my shit together. I sorted out my whole life. I moved down to Wellington. I studied. I got a scholarship. I got all of this stuff so that I could eventually go and live in Japan. Went over for an exchange and then ended up getting working holiday, getting a job. All of that stuff happened. But it was, this kind of meditative space. I always think it was the best job I ever had, was cleaning up fucking office buildings in the middle of the night. And in Hastings, honestly, man, it was like the least stress, the most beautiful kind of moment, sort of the twilight of the Hiratonga Plains. So, that's how I ended up here. It sounds a bit strange, but that's how fate sort of works sometimes.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
It sounds epic.
And what about you? You spent a bit of time in London, of all places, as well. Like, what's your sort of origin story? Where are you from, and how did you end up over there and then back in New Zealand?
So Auckland, born and raised, and then I went to Dunedin for university, and then back to Auckland, where I started my finance career. And actually, I was desperate to go to Canada, not to London. Desperate to go to Vancouver, but to be honest, I couldn't get a job in Vancouver. I could only get a job in Toronto, which I hate to say is the ultimate concrete jungle. And I'd been a weekend in London visiting my mates, And then I kind of did some stuff in Europe, and then I went to a couple of job interviews in Toronto. And then I was like, I just can't do this. So straight away took a job in London, and there we were 5 years later, came home. It was, I mean, it's an awesome place, and it's definitely a hard place to raise a family, but it is a pretty amazing place to live.
Did you find that you talk about family, so you came back to New Zealand as part of that, kind of with kids?
Yeah, I did. So for me, I'd always wanted to come back and live in New Zealand in the long term. And it's, to be fair, I probably burnt out a little bit. I worked too hard in London and just needed a bit of a change. And yeah, so that was kind of why I came back. So standard story, came back pretty quickly. I was married, had kids, and now I've got a business, which is just adds a whole nother layer of stress to everything.
Yeah, I know that feeling, and it's a common story. I've had a few people talk to me about sort of wanting to come back and have that sort of barefoot grass, kind of beach life kind of thing going on in New Zealand, which just isn't really possible in many parts of the world. And so,
it's an interesting one, right? So I've now been back 10 years, and increasingly I kind of go, is it time to go again? I think there are some amazing places in the world that you can go. And I thought, well, look at you. Yeah. And that's, to be fair, it's one of the hardest things about my job right now, is I am stuck in Auckland. There's no question on it for the foreseeable future. But there are some amazing places in the world that you can live an extremely good life. And I think it's probably one of the saddest things about where we are in New Zealand right now is when you get people like me going, actually, you know what? I could have a really good family life elsewhere, and I don't necessarily, if I didn't have to be in Auckland, I probably wouldn't be here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I certainly understand that. I think New Zealand has changed quite a lot over the last few years. And when I came back, which was late 2019, it was sort of the great escape back home. And certainly I have a lot of fondness, for New Zealand, and especially Hawke's Bay and Wellington, where I spent most of my time. But certainly things have changed, and I hope today we can talk a little bit about what you're working on with your business, Rupert.
Yeah,
definitely. But just before we get to that, your story. So you moved to London. You're working in finance there. You came back, and sort of this idea to start your business. So maybe we can go from there. But like, how did KiwiSaver come about? Like, what was the impetus for that? And yeah, maybe the origin story of your business.
So KiwiSaver came about for two reasons, actually. One was, hey, I come from an entrepreneurial family, and I'd always wanted to do my own thing. I'd also spent 10, 15 years, 12 years, I think, in the finance industry in various roles. And what became really clear to me in those roles was that the finance industry had been designed for the finance industry. It wasn't an industry that had been designed for customers and end clients in mind. And then I saw kind of two things around KiwiSaver, right? I saw KiwiSaver was a great product that had a whole massive set of issues around it, very low engagement, very low understanding, and the honest truth that high fees, and the honest truth that it was unlikely to deliver what people expected it to deliver. And so we'd kind of compared the KiwiSaver model then to what was happening internationally. And we thought there was quite a big opportunity to give people the answers they need to make some smarter decisions, and also give them some choices. Let's be honest, KiwiSaver, it is your money. It is your hard-earned savings. And so what we were all about was going, well, how do we create a few more options? How do we make it a little bit easy? How do we make it more interesting for people so that we can then get them engaged? Because if we don't get people engaged, the truth is they're going to sleepwalk into some pretty shitty retirements. And so the purpose of our business was all about how do we use our products and our tools to help people make better decisions and increase their engagement in KiwiSaver.
Yeah, I guess coming back a little bit, zooming out as to what KiwiSaver is. I mean, it's sort of, there's some apocryphal stories from my grandparents around the old, what was it, the super fund, and Rob Muldoon before he robs you, and all of that stuff. But just real quickly, like, how did KiwiSaver come about? Because this is relatively new, especially compared to Australia or perhaps the UK. I'm not quite sure how it compares, but having a a system like this is relatively new for New Zealand. It was sort of what, early 2000s when KiwiSaver came online?
KiwiSaver was introduced into legislation in 2005.
Yeah.
And then finally kind of the first schemes launched in very late 2006, early 2007.
But
Brought in by
sort of
Michael
before that
Cohen.
though, what were the options, and sort of how did that all?
To be honest, there wasn't anything.
Yeah.
So Robert Muldoon tried to bring in, no, sorry, the Labor government before Robert Muldoon brought in a superannuation program. But that Labor government then got voted out. I think it was in 1978, 12 months later. And so he cut it. He just killed the whole program because his view was we don't need to be kind of helping people save their retirements. We had NZ Super, so most people know that as the pension scheme. And the view was, look, for those that need it, we have that. But we don't need to do anything else, that people can save for themselves and people can do what they want. And so New Zealand was extremely late to the party. You might have been very lucky. You might have worked for a government department. You might have been a teacher, a nurse, or some of those big corporates in the 90s still had pension schemes. But actually, the majority of New Zealanders, it was very, very unusual to have any private pensions. You had your savings, you had the $300 a week that you get from the government, but it's not like what happened in the US, the UK, Australia, where you had these massive state-sponsored kind of pension schemes to help people save their retirements. We were definitely out on a limb there.
Yeah, and I think that, would you say though we're seeing the implications of that now, sort of that era of people coming into retirement?
I think age poverty is a massive thing here in New Zealand, and we are definitely starting to see that. At the end of the day, the pension has been indexed to inflation. It hasn't kept up with wages. It is no longer anywhere near enough for anyone to survive on. Let's be honest, it's $342 a week if you live as a couple, which is kind of, good luck, particularly in a generation now where a lot of people don't even own their own homes. And so, we are starting to see the price of a country that has very low savings rate and has never actually saved for their retirements. And the bigger problem we have, which is a problem for today, but more importantly, it's a problem for 10 years' time or 20 years' time, because we don't have a private pension scheme. New Zealand can't afford to maintain our very generous superannuation program that we have today, right? Today, our pension scheme costs us 4.5% of GDP. Over the next 20 years, that's expected to grow to 7.5% of GDP. Other countries have managed this expense by kind of using means testing or other ways to go, look, we're going to support the retirements for the people that need it. But for those that can afford it, we're going to incentivize them to contribute towards their retirement while they're working so that we don't have to pay for it when they do retire. And it is going to be a massive issue. We're currently looking at a government which deficits for the foreseeable future. Plus, we've got rising healthcare costs, rising superannuation costs, just because of our aging population. I think it's about to become a real big conversation, but we don't have an answer to because we actually haven't encouraged people to save for that alternative.
Well, I guess pulling on that thread here, talking about financial literacy and really how a lot of these legacy systems have been very difficult for people to understand, and it becomes even more difficult when you're working hard, you're busy, you don't have the time to really look into all of the details. And something like Bitcoin, as you know, presents a really easy proposition. It's sort of you just buy and then you hold, and it sort of flips a lot of the traditional finance thinking on its head. And this is something that Kōura is looking at with your carbon neutral cryptocurrency fund, which I'm keen to talk about, and sort of how that came about, and perhaps your thoughts on the role of Bitcoin as a long-term store of value and these kinds of things. So what are your thoughts on that, Rupert?
So look, I'll go back to the start. So we launched Bitcoin 18 months ago, and the reason we did that is, to be blunt, we got a lot of questions from our clients about it. We could see that it was an asset class that was becoming increasingly popular. A lot of clients kind of went, hold on a sec, Bitcoin is a core part of my investment world and my investment portfolio. Why can't I do this with my KiwiSaver, which is actually the largest investment account that we have? And by the way, who are you finance professionals to tell us what we can and cannot invest in? Because I actually bet most of you professionals have got some Bitcoin on the side anyway. And so for us, it was like, and that was the light bulb moment. It was like, you know what? Actually, there's a really good point. Who am I to say what you can and what you cannot invest in? What I have to do, though, is we then said, okay, cool, let's have a look at this and let's explore it. So the second question that came up for me and my investment committee was, well, can we do this in a way that does not put everyone's that does not put everyone's retirements at risk? Look, I am actually a believer in the underlying technology of cryptocurrencies, but actually that's a moot point, right? Because we need to be confident that given the uncertainty around it, we needed to put structures in place to make sure that, you know what, if crypto goes to zero, we're not going to cause people to lose and their retirements turn to complete shit. And so that's where we kind of got quite creative and we came up with our structures, a huge amount of work to understand an optimal portfolio allocation. And so we did a lot of work looking at historical trends, international research, and took the view that 3% of an equity portfolio was about where Bitcoin can be an optimal way, right? It's a great spot where it can give you a meaningfully different return because it'll give you a massive spike in returns if it continues to trend in that way, or alternative. But it also means that, hey, the volatility isn't going to cause too much damage to your portfolio if it goes the other way. And then we said 3% recommendation, and then the key was the 10% limit. And then when we did that, we also combined that with our approach to rebalancing. Really technical way of saying rebalancing is really our way of forcing people to sell high and buy low. Because every 6 months, what we're going to do is we're going to sell your top performers and take some of the profits away from the top performing assets in your KiwiSaver portfolio. And then we're going to buy some of the low performers. And it's a really nice way of continuing to make sure you do dollar cost average. So kind of what we got to as a business and as an investment committee, we were like, yeah, cool. Okay, we're confident enough in the long-term time prospects of Bitcoin. We believe we've got a really nice structure in place that means our investors will continue to dollar cost average into Bitcoin, ideally for a 35-year kind of period. So they're going to see through the cycles of this highly volatile asset class. And we've also put some limits and structures in place to make sure that we're not going to blow up people's retirements. And that was was a big piece of work. We got a lot of flack from regulators and from other industry participants for it. But hey, it's fundamentally, it comes back to my core fundamental belief is we need to give people the options to invest their KiwiSaver how they want. We need to treat people like adults. And this is what that was all about.
Yeah, that's great. In terms of, we're talking about Bitcoin here, so I'd like to just clarify the carbon neutral cryptocurrency fund is exclusively looking at Bitcoin. Is that right?
At this stage, it is. We continue to review whether we should put other assets in there.
Please don't.
But again, pardon?
Please don't. Bitcoin is, I mean, but like, sorry, I'll let you finish.
Well, I think for us at the moment, we can't get ourselves comfortable on the long term. We see, so Bitcoin has become a proxy for the entire industry. And so it's become a really nice proxy and almost an index on its own. There's no way we're doing anything small. Every now and then we look at Ethereum and go, look, is Ethereum now big enough and now mainstream enough that we can be confident in the longevity of that? Look, it's something we ask ourselves every 3 to 6 months. We haven't got ourselves comfortable on that question yet, but it's just one of those things that we continue to evolve. I don't know, what I said earlier, right? I firmly believe in the technology. I firmly believe in what cryptocurrencies and the distributed ledger and the blockchains will enable. Will Bitcoin be the long-term winner? I don't know the answer to that. And that's why by calling it a cryptocurrency fund and creating the ability to have other assets in there, that's what I'm trying to do, is just preserve a little bit of flexibility for myself as well.
Yeah, no, that's all good. Thank you. Sorry, I interjected earlier.
No, it's a great question, right?
No, well, I guess the way I see it, I mean, this show is focused on Bitcoin, and I think from a technology perspective, I think if you sort of squint your eyes, it seems like there's sort of a lot of overlap and that they feel like they're the same thing. And perhaps when this fund was being developed, there was a certain narrative going around, whereas I think just seeing some of the way things have unfolded, especially over the last few years, it's certainly clear to me that Bitcoin is its own thing, and then there's kind of everything else, which I wouldn't say it's even on the coattails of Bitcoin, but it's sort of there's an affinity there that makes it seem like it's in the same world. Whereas I think looking at the entire piece of how Bitcoin is used, its value system, its immutability, its fixed supply, these kinds of questions, I think that's the value proposition that, as people learn about it, they're like, okay, that's why I want Bitcoin and Bitcoin only. And everything else, it's sort of, that's where you get the kind of the mimetics of, these massive price spikes and things going to zero and the rug pulls and all of these kind of, this language is used. Whereas, I mean, Bitcoin, it just keeps on chugging, and I think that gives a lot of stability to people's kind of sense of what it's supposed to do, and then it goes and does that, and it sort of becomes self-fulfilling as well.
I agree. Over the last 12, 18 months, I think if anything, that's become an even stronger perspective and an even stronger view. I mean, the slight niggle in the back of my mind is my traditional finance kind of training, right, which is all about diversification.
Yeah.
And that's why I kind of go, we need to continue to kind of assess and think about that, right? Increasingly, I think actually over the last 12 months, that the store of value, the lack of the 21 million cap, all of those things do make it very, very different. And actually, even when you think about Ethereum, right, that is a technology that is doing something. We know there will be a better solution at some point in time. It might be Solana, it might be whatever the next one is. So they are different characteristics, but we just want to make sure, or from my perspective, when I'm thinking about my investors and what we're doing for the long term, we just want to make sure we don't kind of lock out any optionality and go, cool, well, this is where it has to be. We're trying to preserve a little bit of optionality.
Yeah. Well, look, that's understandable. And I mean, you mentioned earlier that it was the consumer demand that was driving the development of this piece. But I think the conflict with the TradFi paradigm is certainly something I've encountered. It's difficult because it is, I mean, from my perspective, it is such a changing, it's such a powerful change. This dynamic of, well, what if Bitcoin just continues to be this black hole that eats the traditional finance sector completely? And in a way, it's sort of like the internet. If you are to ask newspapers and radios what they thought of the internet back in the 80s or the early 90s, they would have thought, oh, it hasn't got a chance. And now all of those things are delivered through the internet. And so I see, with this emerging ETF project that's happening in the United States, we're seeing all of this massive flow of money come into Bitcoin. And it's sort of like, the tail starting to wag the dog as it stands head and shoulders above, the general TradFi kind of fiat world. And I think people are beginning to, if they haven't already, are starting to pick up that something, changes afoot. And I think that's why something like your fund, which provides tax advantage and, government contributions and all of these other kind of benefits you would get with a traditional KiwiSaver, but then you also get Bitcoin, which is actually what people want. It's sort of, I mean, we're in a period of change and transition, but certainly my perspective is that, Bitcoin eats everything. And we'll look back and be like, man, what were we doing buying houses and investing in stocks? We should have just bought Bitcoin. But that's obviously quite a controversial statement.
But I think, I think that's my view on that would be, I do think it and we are starting to see the success, right? And kind of referencing your point, someone approached us and we're actually going to have this conversation and see if we can do it. Someone said, hey, we've got a payment system that we can actually get people now to transfer their Bitcoin straight into your KiwiSaver fund. And so it'll kind of go from their wallet and it'll be just exactly the same as a direct debit and end up as a voluntary contribution into our KiwiSaver fund. And so you are right. A lot of those frictions are reducing, which means that it will become more and more, it will become more and more as a kind of a replacement for some of that traditional finance world. And this is where I reckon personally the ETFs make it so attractive and so interesting, because the ETFs can do an amazing job at reducing volatility. And so one of the things I've been talking to a lot of people about over the last couple of weeks is going, at what point do we get the quantitative and algorithmic traders doing a hell of a lot more in this space? And I get there already were quants and algorithmic traders in the crypto space, but now that they can buy it using their current infrastructure on their current kind of world and their current mandates, you're going to have kind of the amount of capital that's available to invest in this asset class is now 1 million times bigger. And that's going to result in a significant differential, I think, in the demand. And hopefully, because this is what I really want to see, is a reduction in the volatility. Because if we can get rid of the volatility, all of the concerns around payments and traditional finance and all of that stuff disappear. Because all of a sudden I can be confident that I'm going to pay my staff today in Bitcoin. Today they're going to receive $4,000. Next week they're going to receive or the equivalent of $4,000. Whereas at the moment I don't have that certainty.
Yeah, well, I think certainly the narrative is of price discovery, and again, running the scenario, the hypothetical that Bitcoin, similar to the internet, replaces all existing mediums of financial media. The entire world of TradFi, that it goes from zero, which it was 13, 14 years ago, to over $1 trillion in total market cap today, and then that will just continue to go. And the ETFs maybe present a way of sort of continuing that and enabling, just on a functional level, these large institutions to get into Bitcoin effectively. And then maybe one day that sort of starts melting away as well, and these developments in self-custody and other things continue to emerge, or maybe there's this kind of ecosystem of different options. But certainly volatility has always been a question on people's minds. And in a place like New Zealand, it's sort of the slow burn of inflation isn't really as noticeable as you might find in other developing countries where prices can quickly crash and the money is very volatile. And so in those cases, Bitcoin actually represents a less volatile option, whereas New Zealand, it's certainly, the NZD is not really, it doesn't have 10% swings in a day, but Bitcoin does. So certainly we're in this kind of period of transition, but yeah.
And I think you've actually raised a really fascinating point there. And this is one of the big things that we've done a little bit of thinking and talking about, right? There's less than 1 billion of the 9 billion people that live in an economy where you'd be kind of comfortable with a free and fairly traded currency, right? And you kind of think about it, whether in so many parts of the world where you have currency restrictions or you have all of this other kind of stuff. And so I think it's actually really easy for us in our seats here in New Zealand or in Japan to go, well, why would anyone use this stuff when you've got all of those other things? But actually, that's been one of the biggest frustrations about the El Salvador conversation. El Salvador actually, they didn't do it because they thought Bitcoin was going to become, they're going to make a whole lot of money out of putting their reserves into Bitcoin. They did it because they kind of 20 to 30% of their economy is based on remittances from the US, and the average transfer cost is 6.5%. They needed a different way of operating. They needed a way of operating outside of the traditional finance system. I think that's the conversation that we're not having enough of, is actually all of these things that it does for people.
Yeah, and I think, along those lines as well, from my perspective, the yen is incredibly weak right now, and so New Zealand dollar eats yen, and then Bitcoin eats New Zealand dollar. And for me, as a young person as well, I look at my friends and family. It's like trying to purchase a house. Trying to live in New Zealand is extremely expensive. For an entire cohort of young people, housing is simply not an option. And so, what else are you going to do? What's the Kiwi dream now? And I think it's to try and own at least a bit of Bitcoin, and to be part of this new network, this new financial system. And this kind of financial literacy and this kind of KiwiSaver journey that we talked about earlier, I feel like that's kind of being reproduced here. And so, buying a house in Ponsonby in 1970 for $10,000 is buying Bitcoin today. And
Yep.
future generations will look back and be like, man, I wish I had gotten in on that. That's kind of how I'm seeing it, because the housing market is certainly a bit cooked in New Zealand, and in particular in Auckland. So yeah.
Oh, it's not just Auckland, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
I know the housing market, I don't understand it, to be fair. It doesn't work. It's not normal. And you're 100% right. People do need to look at other things. I mean, I am who I am, which means I do have to say, though, people do need to be a little bit careful, and they need to make sure they're managing their risk. And that would be my one counsel. Is I agree to a certain extent with the hypothesis. I do think it's got a lot further to go. But you just need to, if you do need to balance out that approach, and make sure that you've got a little bit of mitigation on the side if it doesn't quite go the way we all expect it to.
Yeah, no, look, that's a good point. And I think that's where it comes down to education as well, because it's not just volatility. It's looking at, if you are self-custodying your Bitcoin, which I think is a really
Yep.
important process to learn. Obviously with your fund, it's, that's not something that the consumer needs to look at. But if you are buying Bitcoin for yourself, learning how to protect and self-custody it, get it off of exchanges, because in the minds of people, I think a lot of the issues are with, they think about the risk of being rugged, of it all going away, which generally is when you're using a third-party custodian to look after your Bitcoin. If you're holding it yourself, the price maybe goes up and down a little bit, but you have access, and only you have access to that Bitcoin, whereas you're holding it with an exchange. And we've had a couple of high-profile failures in New Zealand of exchanges that were custodying funds. That's on them and that's on you for trusting them. So it's sort of, there's kind of a couple of layers of risk there, but certainly holding your own keys, yeah.
100%. But that's also why I love this new world that we live in, right? This new ETF world. Because actually, and of course I'm going to say this because I'm as traditional as they come, but actually, you know what? I'm first one to put my hand up and go, I have actually struggled with wallets, and I don't trust myself with my own wallet. I lose stuff the whole time. I lose my passwords. I lose everything. So that's why I've struggled with a wallet. I do hold some Bitcoin on an exchange. I wake up every day and go, that is just absolutely nuts. And I know that there is a high chance that loses. And that is the unregulated environment that our finance industry always talks about as kind of the risk. But that's where these ETFs are so beautiful, because we've actually, one of the biggest chinks and one of the biggest criticisms of this as a product is completely disappeared, because we've actually moved it from an unregulated world into a regulated world. And I actually think that's where it all starts to get really exciting for me. And I think this is why we're only just seeing the start of what these ETFs can do.
Yeah, I agree, Rupert. And I think, coming back to the internet analogy, I think in the early days, it was about getting phone books onto the internet and then you ring people up. But now you just ring people through the internet. And I think in a way, the ETFs as a gateway for people to self-custody. And the tech's always improving in terms of wallets and these things. So I agree, it's self-custody is a challenge. It's a lot of responsibility, but it's certainly the ETFs have given a lot of mitigations to people's issues there. I just want to come back to the carbon neutral cryptocurrency fund. So the two words at the beginning of that, carbon neutral, can you tell me what those mean?
Oh, look. So, like many KiwiSaver funds, we do have a very substantial sustainability policy where the rest of our funds, we will not invest in fossil fuels. We will not invest in, for the purposes of this conversation, it's fossil fuels, but there's also things like gambling, tobacco, weapons, all of that kind of stuff. One of the big concerns when we tested out this product on a few people for our existing members was, hold on a sec, how does investing in Bitcoin align with your sustainability policy, given the environmental impact that it has? And I think, so that's why what we did is we said, cool, we hear you. We're kind of willing to think about that. And that's why what we've decided to do is we will offset any of the carbon that we believe we are out the Bitcoin we hold, we are responsible for on an annual basis. I think there is increasingly, as we get further and further in this conversation, like many cryptocurrency conversations, gets more complicated and becomes more sophisticated. The debates around that, and I'm not going to lie, we have found that offsetting process a lot harder than we initially anticipated because the range of outcomes is so big, right? And I think we're about to start this exercise again, but for us, we felt it was important that we did not want to be, we wanted to kind of manage the emissions that we are responsible for, and that's how we are doing it here.
Yeah. Well, it's understandable, again, with that customer-driven approach where people come to you and they've been asking for this, and so you are sort of, you need to respond to them. And if that is a concern that's being raised, and it's unfortunate that has become a topic in the mainstream media around the energy use of Bitcoin and what that means. I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of the work that's going on at the moment around sustainable Bitcoin mining in New Zealand. Have you seen that?
Not in New Zealand, but I've seen some of the stuff from overseas, and I've seen a whole lot of the others. It's actually really, the more we've learned, because we've had a few clients who have taken the opposite side of that argument, going, all you are doing by by doing what you're doing is propagating the myth around the energy consumption.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
But I think it is something we are currently looking at. And I do think there is some really cool stuff happening in this space. And I think you're going to start to see, we would like to kind of start to have that conversation in a public forum. And that's the beauty about us being from a traditional space where we can kind of cross over and kind of try and have some of those arguments.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that kind of the narrative, and again, I appreciate that there's a marketplace and people may be asking pointed questions, but I think looking at the work that's taking place, I mean, certainly we could argue that, almost all Bitcoin that's mined in New Zealand is sustainably mined. And then globally, there's more and more of a trend towards renewables. Globally, we're seeing that in places like the United States. So certainly it's a very different story to what is sort of being presented. And I think the argument around energy use is also sort of a bit problematic because it's sort of like the entire financial system. How much energy does that use? The existing financial system.
Well, I've seen the same analogies around money laundering, right? Where they're saying, as a percentage of usage, they think cash actually has a higher percentage used on money laundering than Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And so I actually agree that the comparisons aren't necessarily fair, because even down to some of the stuff I was reading about and we kind of want to start talking to others about is actually the use of mining to load balance across networks and across energy networks. The fact that actually by having a whole lot of mining in a specific space, with agreements on when and how they pull, you can actually empower a whole lot more renewable energy, right? Because when you've got renewable energy, which is by its pure definition, more often than not, it will come in peaks and troughs, and actually it's a great way to balance out the network. So I think it is a conversation that needs to be had, and it is something that we will hopefully kind of start to have in the next few months.
Yeah, no, I look forward to that, Rupert, and I think it could just become the Bitcoin fund offered by Kōura, and it could become
100%.
It could become your most high, or probably, I don't know if it's your highest performing fund for the year, but certainly it looks like it's one of the top ones.
I think it's going to be hard for anyone to beat that fund if the current price continues.
I mean, my other piece of sort of feedback as well, looking at it, you do talk about this 10% cap. Now, is that something that's set from a regulatory perspective, or is that something you guys have set from your governance side?
Look, the key thing, coming back to where I started, right? The key thing we needed to do was say, how can we be confident we're not going to put people's retirements at risk? Me and my investment committee, we're not smart enough to be able to see the future. We don't know whether Bitcoin goes to $1 million or whether it goes to zero. And so for us to be able to offer this product, we need to make sure that under each of those alternative scenarios, we're not going to put someone's retirement at risk. And so that's where we came up. That's why the 10% cap was there. That was a cap that was kind of talked about and worked through with the regulators. But I think fair to say there is no way we would be allowed to offer this product if we didn't have a cap like that in place.
Okay, I understand. And that's interesting. And so would you say maybe longer term, there's perhaps it's a process of negotiation, seeing how things play out. And if that regulators are satisfied, maybe that cap could be increased. People could increase their exposure to your fund.
Yes, short answer. It is something that we look at on a regular basis. For us, I mean, we've talked about it a lot today, the word volatility. Once we see the volatility, once we see kind of two things happen, right? One is the volatility reduce, and that will probably be driven by increased confidence in the longevity and broader adoption trends. Then, we can definitely go further and further. I don't see it being a one-off big step change. It'll probably be small steps over time. But our goal is to kind of increase that holding. It's just when and how we can do that safely. I don't know the answer to that yet.
Yeah, gradually, then suddenly, perhaps. But I'm wondering.
You are probably very right that it will be very slow until it kind of is no more.
Yeah. Hey, I just wanted to zoom back as well, coming back. So, looking through your profile, it says you were working with Vector Energy for a while as well, and looking at solar. And I'm just wondering your time working with Vector, whether that kind of interfaced with some of your thinking around Bitcoin energy use, Bitcoin mining, and if sort of you've seen any crossover with those two worlds.
Oh, look, I actually haven't seen any, but it makes perfect sense, right? The biggest issue that you have with a solar panel is that you are, with a solar panel, most of the energy is generated between kind of 10 o'clock and 4 o'clock during the day when you're not at home. And so that's the big issue around the New Zealand electricity system. We have massive load demand from the peak hours of between 6 o'clock in the morning and 9 o'clock, kind of when everyone gets up and leaves the house. And then again from kind of 5 o'clock through till kind of 9 o'clock at night. Unfortunately, that's not when the sun is generally at its strongest point. And so there's a lot of things that I think, and so that you really, as a household, to make solar economic, on its own, it's unlikely to be economic for most people. Most people go, okay, cool, can I buy a battery? And actually, increasingly, an electric car is an appropriate battery if you don't need to drive to work. But I do believe for a lot of people, crypto mining is an alternative way to use that energy, right? It's a different way of thinking about a battery, because what you're doing is you are using that energy, but you're converting that energy to cash, which allows you to then buy some more energy at a later point. So coming back to the points around actually by using electricity and making sure that as much of it is being used at the points in time when it is generated, that allows us to further invest in the networks. So I firmly believe that as we move more to wind-powered and solar electricity generation, using kind of Bitcoin or other things like that can be kind of turned on and off to manage the load on those networks and manage the excess power demand is going to be really powerful.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I guess come back as well, obviously we're talking this TradFi world of KiwiSaver and ETFs and these kinds of things. But in terms of your understanding of Bitcoin, where you get your Bitcoin information and knowledge from, I mean, how are you exposed to that? What are your pathways for learning about sort of the role of Bitcoin in kind of this rapidly changing world that we're living in?
Oh, look, I'm extremely lucky. I'm surrounded by some extremely smart people. I spend a fair amount of time with some of the folk at Easy Crypto, Darcy Ungaro from New Zealand Everyday Investor. I've learned how to use Twitter, or X now, which has been a bit of a new world. And of course, I spend quite a lot of time every day in most of the financial media. What I find fascinating, and I said this yesterday or last week to a different audience, to a presentation, is the traditional financial media allocate a huge amount of time to crypto. And that's where I find it fascinating. A lot of these views and a lot of these thoughts actually get into Bloomberg, Financial Times, all of those. And I gave the analogy that actually Bitcoin, well, this was 10 days ago, was about number 8 in the S&P 500, but probably had 5 times as much coverage as the number 1 in the S&P 500, which was Apple. Microsoft back then. And so, yeah, that's what I find really interesting is you can become knowledgeable and you can become very informed about what's happening in the space, particularly if you're really only like me and you only really care about Bitcoin, to a certain extent Ethereum. I don't have the time or inclination to go further to your point on it being different. I think traditional media is actually pretty good at it. Not here in New Zealand, I would say. Our New Zealand media don't really seem to like it at all and stay well away. But international media do seem to cover and give quite good basics around what's going on.
Yeah, no, I think that there is a bit of, for some reason, I don't know, maybe you know why, but for some reason, the New Zealand media are quite adversarial and kind of soundbitey when it comes to Bitcoin, and it sort of glosses over all of these benefits and these grid stability, banking the unbanked, all of these very powerful human-centric narratives, and they sort of straw man certain things for some reason. I don't know why.
I suspect it's because if we look at their advertisers.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Look at the incentives. Have you read? Just sort of final question. Sorry, I'm drilling you on this, but have you read any Bitcoin books? Have you?
No.
Okay, if not, okay. Because
the one caveat I will give, I don't read finance books either.
Okay.
I'm not big on. I read a lot of news and a lot of media books. No.
All right. Well, next time you catch up with Darcy, because I've caught up with him on the show quite a few times, I'm pretty sure he's got some Bitcoin books, because there's a few that I can recommend.
Send me through. What should I go to?
I reckon the Bitcoin Standard is probably the go-to. Okay. I would call it the gold standard, but it is the Bitcoin Standard for Bitcoin books. Saifedean Amos, that's a really great one. That's the one that kind of got me, and it just sort of breaks it all down, the history of money, how things like this can basically take over and step change, just like the internet. There's a few others which I can send to you offline, but certainly
I enjoy that. I have a look because I am curious, right? And I think, I am very curious, and I think understanding the next stage. And to be blunt, the people that what's awesome about where we're at in the cycle, and if I wasn't doing my current job, this is where I would be spending all my time and energy, is coming back to that analogy around the internet, right? Do we think that Bitcoin is the network that enables a whole lot of extra stuff to happen? People will crack it. And it's going to be really exciting for those people that either crack the products that sit on top or further build the integrations that go back in between TradFi and Bitcoin as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll tell you, man, having been quite involved with it, being able to just send money, just through my phone to anyone in the world, being able to get paid through Bitcoin, it's like, man, in the old days, you had to send a letter and put a stamp on it and go to the thing. And now you just click a button. It's the same innovation for money. And I think if Kōura and your carbon neutral cryptocurrency fund, perhaps future to be just called the Bitcoin Fund, can really get on that. I mean, honestly, I think there is a lot of opportunity, and I would love to see New Zealand lead the way here, because the other thing that's probably worth mentioning is we are a small country. And I do a lot of writing about New Zealand. I do love the country, even though I'm not there at the moment. And I think some of these bigger incumbent, larger nations are actually going to struggle to really be agile enough to respond. Whereas there is an opportunity for New Zealand, whether it's mining, whether it's consumer access to Bitcoin, these kinds of things, to actually start leading the world, similar to FPOS. We're one of the first countries to have, FPOS payments and these kinds of things. If New Zealand can pick up speed and actually take a head dive into that, dive head first into that, I think it could be really powerful, and we might see some great outcomes.
We wrote an opinion piece on exactly that topic last year in Business Desk, basically saying New Zealand's search for productivity. At the moment, it's all about copying Ireland, copying Singapore, or copying someone else. Whereas we're very different to all those countries. We have to find our own banks, man. Exactly, right. We've got to figure out a way to do it, and we've got to figure out a way to do something on our own. And my view is crypto is a really interesting technology and interesting category that we do have the opportunity to own. I mean, let's be honest, if the government would have put a couple of $100 million into a kind of 15, 20 crypto startups in this country, just imagine what that would do to this industry and what an industry that could potentially create.
Yeah, or they could just buy the Bitcoin themselves. I mean, the Reserve Bank, whatever basket of currencies they're holding on to, put a couple of mil into Bitcoin and see how that performs. I think that the proof would be in the pudding. And I think that's certainly the other piece. Our government is lean enough and accessible enough that these kinds of conversations can happen. And I certainly think, looking at the success El Salvador has seen, they're just, despite what the media has been saying, they've just been stacking Bitcoin the whole time. And they're in a very, very good position. And the economic outcomes I've heard firsthand from people is that, things have changed massively. They've gone from the most dangerous country in the world to basically a tourist hotspot. Everyone wants to get to Bitcoin Beach. Everyone wants to start building in El Salvador to escape cost of living inflation stuff that they're experiencing in their own country. So it's sort of the miracle story, similar to Singapore. It went from a fishing port in the middle of nowhere to being the center of the world financially, and shipping and all of that was bootstrapped over a period of a few decades. It could be that New Zealand and El Salvador and these smaller nimble nations actually become the hubs, following the sort of the way things are changing. So I don't know, man. It's sort of one eye to the future, but certainly exciting times.
Very.
Yeah. But hey, look, Rupert, I appreciate your time and your insight on what's happening with your business. And I really I thank you. If people want to learn more or follow what you're doing, what's the best way to?
Look, the quickest way to learn more, go visit us on one of the standard channels. We're on all the social media stuff, Kōura Wealth, Koura, or come to our website and have an explore, see what crypto looks like for you. Or if I think the biggest one, and we're kind of encouraging a lot of people to go, is for those friends of yours that are a little bit nervous about crypto, not really sure what to do or how to do it, KiwiSaver, in our view, is a great way for people to dip their toes in the water. Yeah. They're going to see how that performs on an individual basis, and it's just a really quick, easy way for them to get there. And that's really what this is about for us, right? The education piece. We talked about that at the start. We want to educate people on how to use this product and how to use it safely. And we believe that's what we do.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much, Rupert.
Thanks, Cody.
Thank you for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the show. I am Cody Allingham, and that was the transformation of value. If you would like to get in touch, please send me an email at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com, and I will get back to you.